Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Be sure to check out Dragon Shield for all of the best accessories to protect your decks. TCG Player for cards at great prices while supporting local game stores. And Patreon, where you get awesome benefits for your direct support. Whenever we go to conventions, we bring our camera equipment and record games with people while we are there. We absolutely love doing this because we get to hang out with awesome people, play some fun games, and see some really cool decks. Tonight's two games are when we recorded at SCGCon Indianapolis. We will be attending more events throughout the year, so stay tuned to our social media and see when we will be coming to your town. We hope you will stop by and record some games with us. Now, let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. First, we have Mike, piloting Winota, Joiner of Forces. This deck seeks to stack the board and trigger Winota as much as possible to create a big enough board state to close out the game. Mike's opening hand contains a Plains, Sokenzen, Crucible of Defiance, Archon of Emeria, Legion Warboss, Phyrexian Walker, Mana Vault, and a Mirage Phalanx. Next, we have Ryan, piloting the partner pair of Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator, and Rograkh, Son of Rograkh. This deck seeks to cast its commanders and polymorph into a combo creature to close out the game. Ryan's opening hand contains a Misty Rainforest, Polluted Delta, Solve the Equation, Jitaxian Probe, Felwar Stone, and his London Mulligans are a Mox Opal and a Steam Vents. After that, we have OKAMI, piloting the partner pair of Ikra Shadiki the Usurper and Krark the Thumbless. This is a Jund Turbo Ad Nauseam deck that looks to abuse Krark's ability to have massive storm turns and eventually end the game with a Witherbloom combo, Underworld Breach, or Dualcaster Twin Flame. OKAMI's super scary opening hand contains a Witherbloom Apprentice, Chain of Smog, Mana Crypt, Jeweled Lotus, Misty Rainforest, Tinderwall, and his London Mulligan is a Diabolic Intent. Finally, we have Andrew piloting Derevi, Imperial Tactician. This is a mid-range list that aims to generate value and slow down the game long enough to assemble the Emil Derevi Gaia's Cradle combo to help close out the game. Andrew's opening hand contains a Rejuvenating Springs, Exotic Orchard, Scorched Ruins, Finehorn Elves, Collector Oof, Finale of Devastation, and a Spellseeker. Without further ado, let's begin this malevolent, mischievous, menacing massacre. Mike had the coolest altered commander and gets to start us off. Mike draws a card for turn and plays a Plains. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts a Phyrexian Walker. He passes. Ryan draws a card for turn and plays a Misty Rainforest. He pays 2 life to cast Jitaxian Probe, targeting OKAMI. He looks at OKAMI's hand and draws a card. Ryan passes. OKAMI draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He cracks Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. He cracks his Jeweled Lotus to help cast his commander, Krark the Thumbless. He casts a Tinderwall. He casts a Mana Crypt. With a strong turn 1 under his belt, OKAMI passes. Andrew draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts a Finehorn Elves. Andrew gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Sokenzen, Crucible of Defiance. He casts his commander, Winota, Joiner of Forces. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Phyrexian Walker. Winota triggers, Mike looks at the top 6 and puts a Recruiter of the Guard onto the battlefield tapped and attacking Ryan. Recruiter enters and Mike fetches up a Rograkh, Son of Rograkh, into his hand. Then Ryan takes it, and in his second main phase, Mike casts Rograkh. Mike ends his turn. At the end of Mike's turn, Ryan cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up a Steam Vents onto the battlefield tapped. Ryan draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He passes. During his upkeep, OKAMI loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Faithless Looting. Krark triggers, OKAMI loses his roll and returns it to his hand. He sacrifices his Tinderwall, adding 2 red. He casts Faithless Looting again. Krark triggers, and he loses his roll and returns it again. He casts Faithless Looting yet again. Krark triggers, and he loses his roll yet again, returning Faithless Looting for the 3rd time. OKAMI sighs and passes to Andrew. Andrew draws and plays a Rejuvenating Springs. He casts his commander, Derevi, Imperial Tactician. It enters and he untaps Exotic Orchard. He casts an Esper Sentinel and passes to Mike. During his draw step, Mike takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He moves to combat and, in response, Ryan cracks his Polluted Delta and pays a life. In response, Mike flashes in an Aven Mind Sensor. It resolves, Ryan looks at the top 4, fails to find, and shuffles. Mike attacks Ryan with Rograkh and Phyrexian Walker, and OKAMI with Winota. Winota triggers twice. Mike looks at the top 6 and puts a Mogcatcher onto the battlefield tapped and attacking OKAMI. He looks at the top 6 again and fails to find. OKAMI, frustrated with his lost flips, throws Krark in front of Winota. Krark dies and everyone takes the rest. With nothing else, Mike ends his turn. Ryan draws and casts a Springleaf Drum. He casts his commander, Rograkh, Son of Rograkh. He curses Aven Mind Sensor and passes the turn. During his upkeep, OKAMI wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws, takes no actions, and passes. Andrew draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He casts a Spellseeker. It enters and Andrew searches the top 4 through Aven Mind Sensor. He fails to find and shuffles. He moves to combat and attacks OKAMI with Derevi and Esper Sentinel. OKAMI takes it, and Derevi triggers twice. OKAMI untaps Derevi and a land. In his second main phase, he casts an Elvish Mystic. Andrew passes the turn. During his draw step, Mike takes the damage from his mana vault. In his main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. Mike moves to combat and attacks OKAMI with Recruiter of the Guard, Winota, and Aven Mind Sensor, and attacks Ryan with Phyrexian Walker and Rograkh. Winota triggers 3 times. Mike looks at the top 6 and puts a Grand Abolisher onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking OKAMI. He looks at the top 6 again and puts a Mother of Runes onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking OKAMI as well. He looks at the top 6 again and fails to find. They all declare no blocks and take the damage. Finished up, Mike passes to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Pirate as it enters. Ryan ends his turn. During his upkeep, OKAMI loses his mana crit roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts Faithless Looting. Esper triggers and OKAMI pays. He then draws 2 and discards 2. OKAMI ships the turn to Andrew. Andrew draws and plays a Gaia's Cradle for turn. He casts Finale of Devastation, where X equals 4. He looks at the top 4 through Aven Mind Sensor and fails to find. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Derevi and OKAMI with Spellseeker and Esper Sentinel. They both take it, Derevi triggers, and Andrew untaps his Derevi, Gaia's Cradle, and Rejuvenating Springs. Andrew passes. At the end of Andrew's turn, Mike activates Mogcatcher, fetching up a Dockside Extortionist onto the battlefield. It enters and Mike creates 3 treasures. Still in the end step, Andrew pays 2 life to cast Noxious Revival, putting Finale of Devastation from his graveyard onto the top of his library. Still in the end step, Ryan casts Snap, targeting Mogcatcher. Esper triggers and Andrew draws. Mogcatcher bounces and Ryan untaps 2 lands. The turn moves to Mike. During his draw step, Mike takes a damage from his mana vault. In his main phase, Urza Saga triggers. Mike floats mana and sacrificing it, fetching up a Gingerbrute onto the battlefield. He casts a Lotus Petal. Esper triggers and Andrew draws. He cracks his petal to help cast Legion Warboss. He moves to combat and Warboss triggers. Mike creates a 1/1 Goblin with haste. He attacks Andrew with Winota and OKAMI with Gingerbrute, Aven Mind Sensor, Grand Abolisher, Recruiter of the Guard, his Goblin Token, Dockside Extortionist, Phyrexian Walker, and Rograkh. Winota triggers 6 times. Mike looks at the top 6 and puts a Combat Celebrant onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Andrew. He looks at the top 6 and puts a Rick, Steadfast Leader, onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Andrew again. Rick enters and Mike chooses First Strike and Lifelink. He looks at the top 6 and puts a Zealous Conscripts onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Andrew. Conscripts enters and Mike gains control of Derevi, untapping it. He looks at the top 6 and puts a Blade Historian onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Andrew. He looks at the top 6 2 more times and fails to find each time. Andrew blocks Combat Celebrant with Elvish Mystic and Winota with Finehorn Elves. They both take the rest. And since many of Mike's creatures now have Double Strike, Lifelink, and +2/+2, OKAMI dies and Mike gains 54 life. Derevi also triggers about 1 billion times and Mike untaps all of his creatures, his mana vault, and his lands. In his second main phase, he casts Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. He casts an Archon of Emeria. Finally finished up, Mike passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Andrew regains control of his Derevi. Ryan draws, takes no actions, and passes. Andrew draws and casts Finale of Devastation, where X equals 3. He searches the top 4 through Aven Mind Sensor and puts a Malevolent Hermit onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan for 2. Ryan takes it and Derevi triggers. Andrew untaps his Exotic Orchard and passes the turn. At the end of Andrew's turn, Mike flashes in a Village Bellringer, untapping his creatures. During his draw step, Mike takes a damage from his mana vault. He moves to combat and Legion Warboss triggers. Mike creates a 1/1 Goblin with haste. Everyone sees the writing on the wall, and they all concede the game to Mike. Wow, what a cool game. Since that was over in a relatively short order, let's show another game tonight. In this game, we have Reed piloting Narset, Enlightened Master. This deck seeks to attack with its commander and cast multiple extra turn and extra combat spells to close out the game. Reed's opening hand contains a Relentless Assault, Narset of the Ancient Way, Land Tax, Misty Rainforest, Arid Mesa, and 2 mountains. Next, we have Noah piloting the Gitrog monster. This deck seeks to leverage its commander in conjunction with Dredge to assemble a super convoluted combo that I really don't feel like narrating tonight. Noah's opening hand contains a Command Tower, Life from the Loam, Jeweled Lotus, Finehorn Elves, and his London Mulligans are a Cabal Ritual, Ramanop Excavator, and a Crop Rotation. After that, we have Quinten piloting Niv-Mizzet Perun. This particular deck seeks to control the board, mill itself out, and then combo off with Niv and Curiosity. Quinten's opening hand contains a Lotus Petal, Wizard Class, Anamatu's Augury, Kasmina, Enigmatic Mentor, Mountain, Island, and a Smoldering Spires. Finally, we have Corbin piloting Jaleva, Nefalia's Scourge. This deck seeks to manually storm off with a lot of spells to win. It also has a backup line with Doomsday. Corbin's opening hand contains an Underground Sea, Scalding Tarn, Cabal Ritual, Windfall, Ponder, Force of Negation, and a Mystical Tutor. Reed's playmat was the most unsettling tonight, so the team let him go first. Reed draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Sacred Foundry onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a land tax, which feels kinda bad going first, and passes to Noah. Noah draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Finehorn Elves. Noah passes. Quinten draws and plays an island. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts a Wizard class. Quinten ends his turn. Corbin draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts Ponder. He looks at the top 3, rearranges, and draws. Corbin gives the turn to Reed. Reed draws and plays an island. Reed passes. Noah draws and casts a Jeweled Lotus. In response, not wanting a turn 2 frog, Corbin casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card, countering, and exiling Jeweled Lotus. Noah, scratching his head, casts a Sylvan Library. Noah ships the turn to Quinten. Quinten draws and plays a mountain. He passes. Corbin draws and plays an Underground Sea. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Talisman of Dominance. He casts Cabal Ritual, adding 3 black. He casts Windfall. Each player discards their hand and draws 6. Finished up, Corbin passes. Reed draws and plays an island. He delves away his graveyard to help cast Treasure Cruise, drawing 3 cards. Reed passes, discarding to hand size. During his draw step, Noah dredges back life from the loam to his hand. He draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library, paying 4 life to keep 1 extra. In his main phase, he casts Life from the Loam, returning Undergrowth Stadium to his hand. He plays Undergrowth Stadium for turn. He casts an Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Noah ends his turn. Quinten draws and plays an island. He levels up Wizard class, drawing 2 cards. He passes to Corbin. During his upkeep, Corbin loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Watery Grave into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts his commander, Jeleva, Navalia's Scourge. It enters and triggers. In response, Reed casts Pongify, targeting Jeleva. Jeleva dies and Corbin creates a 3/3/8. Then Jaleva's trigger resolves and each player exiles the top 4 of their library. Next, Corbin taps his Talisman of Dominance to help cast Wishclaw Talisman. All through, Corbin passes. Reed draws and plays an island. He passes. During his draw step, Noah dredges life from the loam back to his hand. When he mills Ulamog the Infinite Gyre. Ulamog triggers and Noah shuffles his graveyard into his library. He draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library, paying 4 life to keep 1 extra. In his main phase, he plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He casts a Llanowar Elves. Finished up, Noah ends his turn. Quinten draws and plays a Highland Lake into play tapped. Quinten ends his turn. During his upkeep, Corbin loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He activates Wishclaw, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Wishclaw to Quinten. He casts a Lion's Eye Diamond. He taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Grim Tutor. He fetches up a card into his hand and loses 3 life. He casts Underworld Breach. In response, Reed casts Insidious Will, countering Breach. Next, Corbin casts Preordained. He scries 2 and draws a card. Corbin ends his turn. Reed draws and casts a Ghostly Prison. Reed passes. At the end of Reed's turn, Noah flashes in an Oblivion Crown. In response, Quinten casts Swan Song. Oblivion Crown is countered and Noah creates a 2/2 bird. The turn moves to Noah. During his draw step, Noah draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library, paying 8 life to keep them both. In his main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He plays a Snow-Covered Swamp for turn. He casts his commander, the Gitrog monster. No one has any answers, and Gitrog resolves. Noah casts Summoner's Pact, fetching up a Noose Constrictor into his hand. He plays a City of Brass as his Gitrog land for turn. He taps the City of Brass to help cast Noose Constrictor. In response, Quinten casts Read the Runes, where X equals 2, trying to find an answer. He draws 2, discards 2, and has no other responses, and Noose Constrictor resolves. Noah activates Noose Constrictor, discarding Dakmor Salvage. Gitrog triggers, and Noah dredges 2 to return Dakmor back to his hand. Using this loop, he can continually dredge lands and shuffle Titans into his graveyard, stacking more and more draw triggers onto the stack. He does this until he draws his entire library. Noah casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Ad Nauseam. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts a Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He activates Noose Constrictor, discarding multiple cards and a Shuffle Titan, shuffling his Dark Ritual and other cards into his library. Using the Dakmor loop again, he repeatedly draws and recasts Dark Ritual, using the floating black from his previous Dark Ritual. He does this, gaining infinite black. He cracks his Lotus Petal for a green. He now performs the same Dakmor loop, except he now casts and cracks Lotus Petal each time, netting infinite green. He casts Collector Oof, Jaraga Treespeaker, Allosaurus Shepherd, Ramanop Excavator, Elvish Mystic, Dothi Voidwalker, Boreal Druid, and Deathrite Shaman. Next, he casts Finale of Devastation, where X equals 69,420, pumping all of his creatures and giving them haste. He moves to combat, tapping his dorks to pay for Ghostly Prison. He attacks with his team, and Noah wins the game. Ladies and gentlemen, what a fun set of games we recorded at SCGCon Indianapolis. Congrats to Mike and Noah on their wins tonight. In Game 1, Mike's turn 2 Winota quickly spelled death for the table the moment it started landing creatures. he was able to snowball out of control quickly to the point where no one could do anything about their impending fate. In Game 2, Noah played it cool and found the perfect windows to act. His excellent timing made it so that even when disrupted twice, he was able to close out the game. The most valuable card in Game 1 goes to Avon Mind Sensor. This card had such a devastating effect on Mike's opponents. They were so desperate to get answers that they were actually casting tutors into it out of desperation. The most valuable card in Game 2 goes to Summoner's Pact. Noah's Oblivion Crown plan was disrupted by well-timed interaction. This amazing 0 mana value tutor allowed Noah to both cast his commander and cast his discard outlet in the same turn. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Tune in next time when we duke it out to see who will be king of the competitive EDH table. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.